We are back here on Issues and Answers Friday. My Country with Scott Cannon, celebrating 50 years of hip hop culture. 219-885-1371. The number again, 219-885-1371. In the first segment, we talked about the origins of the culture and how, just like everything in our society, it is political. It is political to talk about the origins of hip hop because you can't tell the story of hip hop without talking about how schools were defunded and neighborhoods were left to die on purpose by the politicians of New York City. I talk about it pretty often on this show. A man named Robert Moses, who was the most powerful man in New York City during the 20th century. He is the father of American cities, basically. The modern American city. He was the one who made the decision in the 1940s and 50s that the suburbs would be for white people. That's why when you hear the word suburban today, as an American, you think white people. Urban would be for black people. That's why when you hear the term urban, you think black people. That American cities were designed specifically to funnel black people into the urban ghettos of America during the Great Migration. That's how we ended up in the projects in Chicago or Gary or Flint, Michigan or Detroit or wherever. The cities are designed to do that. And hip hop came from that. Again, choices that our politicians make. Choices that the business communities make to purposely abandon communities, to purposely ship jobs overseas, knowing it will destroy whole communities. And so that is the environment that came out of that. Oh, let me take care of this really quick. Bench Care Family Services are having a foster care celebration on August 26th, 5525 Broadway, Maryville, Indiana. You will be able to learn more about foster care. You'll be able to meet, interact with the staff. You'll be able to meet foster parents and enjoy food and fun. Please come out and meet my homeboy, Shay Grafton, who's a very early member of the United Urban Network. He's been down with us for about 20 years, I think. I think he's been with us 20 years. I'm pretty sure of it. His aunt Janice was a founding member of the United Urban Network. So please come out, show your respect, your support. Shay himself is a great artist. I just was at an art show from him a few years ago in Miller. A brilliant brother who loves his people. You know, if you've ever looked at one of Shay's works of art, I guess, you will see that is a brother who loves his people. You can see the painstaking detail that he puts into all of his drawing. You really can. A very talented brother who's always about giving back. So yes, come on out, support the brother. Benchmark Family Services Foster Care Celebration, 5525 Broadway in Maryville, Saturday, August 26th. Learn more about foster care, meet and interact with the staff, enjoy food, family, and fun. Okay, we were just talking about, again, these social conditions that bred hip-hop. Now, obviously, pretty early on, hip-hop was party music. As we heard in the first segment with the Sugar Hill Gang, it was about stuff like I said, very Muhammad Ali inspired, being pretty, being a good-looking guy, having lots of girlfriends, having a nice car. You know, it was fun. It was disco music. It was party music. Music to make people feel good. But the social conditions in New York City at that time were very dire. Very, very dire. And this new genre of culture, music, art could not ignore the dire circumstances of 1970s New York City. And so this is where you start to really see the influence of Gil Scott-Heron in hip hop in the early 80s, the late 70s, early 80s, with people like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, who were a group of MCs and DJs who did party music. Don't get me wrong, they loved, you can listen to super rap, and they did their share of party music. But what they are probably best known for is a song that I think to this day is the greatest hip hop song ever made, which is The Message. The Message is a tour de force of socio-political commentary about New York City, life for black people in New York City in the late 1970s and early 80s. It addresses drug addiction, prostitution, prison, police brutality, all the things that you would generally get as an experience as a young black person living in New York City during that time. Melly Mel perfectly synthesizes that into a song. And to this day, I don't think hip hop has ever gotten any better. Like, you can't do any better than The Message. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. This is The Message. Yes. That was Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five with The Message. For my money, still to this day, the greatest hip hop song ever made. One of the greatest songs ever made, period. I can't think of a song that more encapsulates what it must have been like for all those young people living in poverty, living with the type of degraded conditions that come from living in a racist society, classist society, built on exploiting black people. You know, it is that simple. And they tell you the story of all the pitfalls that actually came from living in that environment. You can't do it much better than the great Melly Mel, who is the lead rapper on that song. It's funny. Melly Mel has been trending on Twitter all week because he is beefing with the rapper Eminem. You know, he's been beefing recently with the rapper Eminem, and he actually made a diss track aimed at Eminem. You know, basically it sounds like somebody who's, you know, basically was in their peak in the 80s. But I do feel for Melly Mel, because you have to understand, and a lot of people who criticize hip hop and what hip hop has evolved into have to understand that the original creators of hip hop are some of the biggest critics of what modern hip hop has turned into. Melly Mel is basically probably the most important MC in the history of hip hop, because he is basically the prototype for what all MCs would essentially be from that time on. The confidence, the social consciousness, the idea of the MC as superhero, that all comes from him. Everybody flows from him, from LL Cool J to Tupac to Eminem, you know. And Melly Mel, when he talks about what hip hop has evolved into, or should I say devolved into today, is always very disappointed in what modern hip hop has turned into. And so you have to feel a lot of empathy, because he's saying, look, when we started in the 70s, we had a specific goal in mind when it came to hip hop, which was we wanted to have fun. We wanted to unite people and bring people together. And we wanted to overcome the reality of our surroundings. We wanted to inform people. We wanted to educate people. That's why he did stuff like White Lines, Don't Do It. Another classic song from Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, warning people about the dangers of cocaine, which was probably sorely needed in the early 80s from everything I've seen. A lot of people should have listened to White Lines and not done it. Maybe some of you out there, I don't know. Hopefully you're still with us if you did. But he intended hip-hop to have a social consciousness. He and Africa Bambaataa and Kool Herc, all these people intended to create a culture that would bring people together, unite people, and people could have fun, while at the same time being informed of what was happening on the streets on a daily basis. And so I really do feel a lot for Melly Mel. A lot of people talk about him because he's very down and often sounds very bitter and very negative about a lot of modern rappers. And I always tell people, look, this is not what he intended hip-hop to be. What you hear on the radio today, the crap you hear on the radio today, is not what Melly Mel had in mind. That is not what he had in mind. So obviously him being the Wilt Chamberlain, the George Mikan of hip-hop, the prototype of what rappers would be, while at the same time seeing it distorted, has to be very painful for him and painful for a lot of the originators of what hip-hop has turned into. But obviously at that period in the 80s, you saw a rapid evolution in hip-hop music, hip-hop culture. You saw people like Run DMC, Houdini, UTFO. You saw a lot of groups at this point bringing a new dimension to hip-hop, sort of taking it even further than Melly Mel and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five could in terms of being mainstream. These people were able to go to MTV, cross over to white audiences. And that's when things started to get murky. Obviously, when hip-hop was a black thing and just a few white people, who were from the east side of New York, who were sort of cool white people involved in punk rock and other artistic movements, that's one thing. But when people in Kansas start hearing Walk This Way with Run DMC and Aerosmith, then, it's a whole new ball game. It is a whole new ball game. Hip-hop evolved very radically and very quickly, very rapidly during this time period in the 1980s. By the late 80s, Run DMC and Houdini and Grandmaster Flash and these people are sort of out of style, out of touch. You have a whole new generation of MCs who's taken it somewhere even further and even more mainstream than the group before. People like Eric B. and Rakim, Public Enemy, Boogie Down Productions, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, the Beastie Boys, the first white act in hip-hop to really solidify hip-hop as a genre that could have legs with non-black audiences. A lot of people may not have liked it at the time, but, the Beastie Boys were the first rap group to ever have a #1 album in America. For a while, their License to Ill was the best-selling rap album of all time. But of course, I cannot talk about the 1980s, urban America, and hip-hop without talking about crack. Crack cocaine. It changed everything. It changed all of our lives. I guarantee if you live here in the city of Gary, if you live in East Chicago, if you live in Hammond, if you live in Chicago, if you're on the south side listening to this, what's up? All my people on the west side, listen to this. What's up? Crack changed your life. It changed all of our lives. And of course, hip hop would be changed by crack cocaine as well. Because with the rise of crack, you get gangster rap. You get hardcore hip hop. You get rappers no longer just saying, don't do drugs. Let's all get together and hang out. They are funded by these crack dealers who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them are making millions of dollars selling crack. And these drug dealers are giving these rappers tons of money to go into the studio and basically glorify them, In the case of one particular drug dealer named Eric Wright, he would start his own group called NWA, or Niggas with Attitude for those who are the uninitiated. And this was not the sort of social consciousness of Melly Mel or Public Enemy. This was a whole new way of looking at it. These kids from California, because that's where NWA were from Compton, California, from LA, they grew up in a whole different culture than New York City. And the gang culture of LA is a lot different than the gang culture of New York City. And so their records were a lot harsher. People were saying things on records from 88, 89 on that had never been said before. Melly Mel would have never dreamed of saying the things on records that Eazy-E, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, MC Ren were saying on record, that Ice-T was saying on record. He would have never dreamed of it. Run DMC would have never dreamed of it. Houdini, these people would have never dreamed of saying these things. But crack changed the game. Just like it changed all of our lives here. It created a cycle of hyperviolence that I believe we're still sort of starting to come out of now. Don't get me wrong, over time crime did sort of go down and peter out. But still, most of the crime that we have in our cities today is still crack-related violence. It's still the cocaine trade, crack trade violence. These gangs that control the crack trade, for the most part, are the ones who are committing most of the crime in Chicago and in most of the country. And it's important to understand that there will always be a theme on this show about choices, policy choices. Our government, the United States government, chose to help Nicaraguan drug cartels. You can look it up. Look up the name Oscar Danilo Blandón. He was he worked for the United States government. He was a drug dealer, a Nicaraguan drug dealer. He worked for the government. He supplied Freeway Ricky Ross and drug dealers in California specifically with copious amounts of crack, of cocaine, I'm sorry. And the U.S. government, the CIA specifically, helped spur the crack epidemic, which brought so much money to, like I said, these crack dealers, but also brought an extreme amount of violence that nobody had ever seen in modern history with it. Whose fault is that? Always put the fault where it lies, with the government, with the people, the institution that created these social conditions. They flooded these communities with drugs and then sat back, watched the damage. People like Joe Biden, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, all these people then created all these draconian drug laws to throw all the drug dealers and people who had used drugs, not Hunter Biden though. Hunter Biden doesn't go to jail. Amy Biden doesn't go to jail. But your son will go to jail. Your father will go to jail. Your brother will go to jail. And our communities will be war zone because our government flooded our communities with this. And the music began to reflect the mentality of the people who were making all this money off of crack. It's unfortunate. The U.S. government destroyed all the civil rights organizations of the 1960s and the 1970s. They destroyed the Black Panthers. They destroyed the Nation of Islam and may have killed Malcolm X. We'll have to see how the lawsuit that his daughter is bringing against the city of New York and the FBI goes. But I think it's pretty safe to say that the government at least had something to do with the death of Malcolm X. They destroyed all the leaders, put drugs in our communities, created draconian laws with draconian sentences. People who touch a substance get more time in prison than child molesters and rapists and murderers. And again, you know, the music began to reflect that reality. A lot of people don't agree with it. I'll leave that up to you. That's your opinion. That's your, you know, your belief. And you have a right to your opinion here on Issues and Answers, My Country. Give me a call, 219-885-1371. I'd like to hear your opinion. But the rise of crack is what changed hip hop, and it's what changed Black America, and it's what changed America in general. And it's important to understand that when you're putting all this into context of what our modern society has turned into. But of course, hip hop didn't just look at it from the perspective of drug dealers or gangsters. It did try to mount a counter offensive as well. People like Public Enemy, people like KRS-One, people like MC Lyte, they got together. And they made a track called Self-Destruction about trying to stop crack cocaine and the destruction that it was bringing.